Hello. This is the last episode of the three-parter with my personal hero, Pete Fenlon, founder of Iron Crown Enterprises, Rolemaster, MERP. In this episode, Pete tells us about the fall of Iron Crown Enterprises into bankruptcy, why it happened, what happened afterwards, and we'll end with a light-hearted look at some of those monikers using the credits page of the MERP rulebook. As mentioned in the previous episode, due to technical issues, I had to enhance the audio, which makes it sound a little artificial in places. Anyway, here's the final part. So this is always a sticky point to bring up. We're at one point, I think, when it was released, I read somewhere that it was the second best-selling RPG of that year.
Yeah, we were the second best-selling RPG of that year, and we ultimately became the second best. At the time, we were still active. We were the second best-selling fantasy role-playing game at that time in history.
Yeah. And then you had all the source books come out, but then things went wrong. Are you comfortable talking about that, Pete? About what actually?
Absolutely, totally comfortable.
Okay, great. What happened?
Okay, well, it's a lot. So we were always a company that was financed from the books that we sold, the games that we sold, the commercials, things that we could offer the public. We never had a big investment. We never had a giant war chest. So we always ran a little bit close to the or a lot close to the chest, when it came to revenues and reinvesting in ourselves and taking risks and the like. That meant that ICE as a company was very much self-funded. We did pretty well by that, but we had a couple of events over the course of our history that were destabilizing that ultimately led to ICE's demise after 20 years. The first was in the mid 80s, we decided to do game books, interactive books, choose your own adventure books based on Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Narnia, and Sherlock Holmes. And the first project in that series was going to be based on Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And we got a proposal together. We showed that proposal to Tolkien Enterprises, and we merrily began developing game books, which we called Tolkien Quest game books. We were very excited about that. And that project proceeded and pretty well. And we ended up with four pretty strong titles, and we started manufacturing those with the approval of Tolkien Enterprises. We thought we had a pretty big hit on our hands because our book distributor, Berkeley Books, was very excited, and they'd ordered hundreds of thousands of each title. And it looked like we had Barnes and Noble, or actually at the time, B. Dalton's, which was the big mass market chain, and Walden Books. Very, very excited about these game books. So anyway, I went to England the summer of the release of those books. I think that would have been probably would have been 1985 or 86. I can't remember exactly. It was the project was coming together.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it was 86. We were about to release these books, and I went to George Allen and Unwin, who was then our book distributor in the UK, and I presented the program at their offices at 40 Museum Street. And I might note I just went there. They're no longer there anymore, but that was where I used to visit Rainer Unwin once or twice a year. And Rainer was quite interested. It seemed like a pretty cool program right up their alley. They were going to be able to sell these things, throughout the book trade in the UK because they're a fabulous bookseller or a book publisher and had great reach into the book trade.
Right.
Their managing director, unfortunately, looked at these things and said, "Oh my God, these are books. They're not games." And so I realized very quickly over the course of that meeting, we had a big problem. And it turned out that Tolkien Enterprises and George Allen and Unwin had never contemplated the idea of game books. And that one company thought they were games and one company thought they were books.
Right.
And it would be about a year or two, actually about 18 months before we were able to figure out how to divide the spoils. And in the process, we learned a bunch of things. First of all, the Tolkien estate did not want anything named Tolkien Quest. They wanted Middle Earth Quest was fine, but not Tolkien. You couldn't name anything that, after Tolkien that he didn't himself want to put his name on.
Right.
And that made sense. Now, of course, Tolkien Enterprises would later have to change its name because of the same positioning, but we didn't know that at the time.
Hmm.
So that was a huge blow to us. That cost us about $2 million or more at a time when we were making that in a whole year. And so we were suddenly in debt quite a bit in order to kind of survive. We were, unstable for quite some number of years as we sort of struggle through that process of getting game books out. And the problem was game book market collapsed by the time we actually got those game books out. And although we made some money, we never recouped the money that we had lost by having to destroy the first batch of game books and then wait and develop the next batch, the next round, with input from both George Allen and Unwin and Tolkien Enterprises. So that was destabilizing. Now later we were able to get back to health when we developed the Middle Earth collectible card game. And that was a huge hit, and it was a big labor of love, very ambitious. But we got started on that late because we had licensed Wizards of the Coast to do a Magic variant or an original CCG based on Middle Earth, and they, even though they really wanted to do it and they licensed the rights from us, they took so long to do it that we ended up taking the rights back and doing it ourselves.
Right.
And we released that CCG, that collectible card game, in record time and made a whole lot of money. But the problem was that the card game market, we did have not realized at the time, was beginning to soften. And so this was the late 90s. This would have been 1996 through 99. A number of events occurred to sort of continue, it destabilize us once again. Because if we'd already used a lot of the money from the collectible card game to get back to health.
Yeah.
And so we're not able to reinvest that, put that in essentially in the pocket and just take that profit. We were forced to look very carefully when we reinvested into the card game or any other project that we're going to do. And so we ended up overprinting some of well, certainly some of the supplements to the original Middle Earth, the Wizards game, and particularly Middle Earth, the Dragons. We overprinted quite a bit, and it tied up a lot of our cash and essentially put us in a tough position in terms of cash flow because we once again were making a lot of money, but we had to reinvest a lot every time we did a new card series. While this was going on, the computer game revolution was continuing in full force, and a lot of role playing that had been done tabletop style was now moving to computers. A lot of early role players were experimenting with role playing on computers and computer role playing games and computer adventure games, really. And even though the stories were primitive and the narrative and actually all of this stuff was very primitive, it was fascinating to people. And so a lot of role players kind of left the business and started experimenting with, all kinds of different computer games. And then the retail market in the United States for games started to soften as a whole because a lot of retailers had moved into focusing on collectible cards like Magic and less on role playing. And that was occurring. And it meant that there was a downward spiral in terms of the sales of our traditional role playing games.
Right.
Didn't matter if it was Middle Earth or role playing. So all that was occurring in the late 90s. At about the same time that Peter Jackson came along with a project that would later be his trilogy for The Lord of the Rings and subsequently The Hobbit. Our relationship with Tolkien Enterprises has always been very good. We jokingly saved the payroll for one of their movie projects because they were also a major motion picture company. They were a major sound company, the Solzhenitsyn company, their parent company.
Mhm.
They had won Oscars, Academy Awards for Amadeus and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And we actually ended up giving them a huge royalty check at a time when they were struggling with payroll for The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And they were very thankful about that. And we thought, well, we've had these rights for 18 years. We will always be able to get our rights renewed. And when Peter Jackson came along with The Lord of the Rings,
Mhm.
that the situation changed because number one, Rainer Unwin had retired. His company had been taken over, been a hostile takeover after he had merged George Allen and Unwin with Bell and Hyman, became Unwin Hyman, and that company was taken over by Rupert Murdoch. And Rainer essentially was it sent into retirement, if you will. And so he disappeared from the battlefield. He had been a big advocate and a friend all those 18 years. And then the executor of the estate who I had also counted as a friend and had been an ally, he also retired and later passed away.
Oh no.
And so what happened was our advocates within the Tolkien world had sort of disappeared. And as they were leaving the battlefield, then suddenly the Peter Jackson came along and the estate and everybody, in fact, started re-examining all of the contracts related to The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. And they realized, I think a lot of them, that there was a lot of money to be made, surrounding the movies, and the rights were kind of in turmoil at the time, and they decided to break up our license into bits, basically, because we had all of the gaming rights,
Mhm.
and they felt that, hey, this is a small company in Virginia. They generated millions of dollars in royalties, but not enough to really justify this kind of deal. And there were a number of people knocking on the door because of the movies, wanting to offer them a ton of money.
Right.
Games Workshop on the miniature side, and various other folks. So at the time when we needed to renegotiate our license, we were suddenly faced with the idea that we'd have to, in a Dutch auction, bid on the role playing side, the board game side, the miniature side, everything separately. And we would have to outbid companies that were much bigger than us with much more cash.
Yeah.
And in fact, we couldn't do that. So all of that occurred in a perfect storm while the sales of Rolemaster were tapering off because of the computer game situation. And while we were not in the best financial health anyway. So ultimately, it was the death of the company. We were in a situation where we were forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which is a reorganization bankruptcy, and sought to reorganize ourselves. And we realized after a point that we could probably do that. In fact, we did work under a Chapter 11 program for about a year. But ultimately, I decided, and it had to be my call, as president of the company, as original founder, that it was over.
Mm.
In 2000, I remember looking at the situation and saying, that ultimately, we got to call it a day. Now we had been we had suffered a lot in terms of having fallen behind in taxes, and I was very honest about reporting those to the government, and myself as as a lawyer, I knew how serious that was.
Mhm.
In fact, I called them and said, "Hey, we owe you guys a bunch of taxes," and ultimately ended up having to pay them. I think it was $6,000 a week for 90 weeks at one point in cash, which was not the easiest thing. So when we fell behind in taxes again, when Bruce, our CFO, said that he had not been able to keep up with payroll taxes again, and this was lethal, absolutely lethal in my mind. I said, "This is it. we're going to have to shut this whole thing down. And that's what happened in end of October of 2000, the year 2000.
And was that was your end of dealing with Iron Crown as it was then?
Yeah, it was because I, even though I loved Iron Crown, it was a labor of love. I'd gotten a career and a marriage out of it and the like. When the smoke cleared and the bankruptcy court had settled things, Tolkien Enterprises had reacquired all the Middle Earth rights, and a guy who had been working with me to try and found a company called Middle Earth Games. There's a broader project to basically deal with all of those challenges I had talked about earlier. Putting together a consortium of companies, Mythic Entertainment for online gaming, backed by Microsoft, putting together a new miniatures company to compete with Games Workshop, all that stuff. A guy who I'd worked with on that project who had come from ING Barings, a big financier, a big banking operation in the Netherlands and the UK. He had been the guy that was going to provide the financing for all of that. He ended up personally acquiring Rolemaster and a lot of the assets out of the bankruptcy. And he and I at the time were not great friends. We were not seeing eye to eye. I didn't really want to work with him or for him. And I just said to Olivia, I think we need to do something else. I need to do something else in life. And it turned out had gotten a call about that same time. I got a call from a friend who had said, "Hey, Steven Spielberg, who's one of his friends, had been a big fan of an idea that we had years before about a global transmedia storytelling project." And he had a movie that he picked up from Stanley Kubrick called AI, Artificial Intelligence. And
Mm-hmm.
he was trying to finish this movie, didn't really know how to market it, didn't really know exactly how to finish the movie. But he was excited about this project that we had talked about. And the DreamWorks guys wanted to hire us as to build that alternative reality game and to market the movie. And ultimately, they wanted to hire me to run it because I was a lawyer and a storyteller and, well, a guy who could do that. And so ultimately, that was an offer that I couldn't ignore. And there was that impulse. Plus, we had bought in 1996, we had bought with the Middle Earth money invested in Mayfair Games. And we knew that the business might evolve in different ways. So we had bought this company, Mayfair Games. We bought it because of Catan. I had a belief that Catan could be the world's most successful board game. I had belief that it could be the game people thought about when they thought about board games in the future. And I wanted to make that dream reality because I felt that was a positive thing for society, that Catan was a way better game than Monopoly or any of those kinds of games. And so that project also was still up in the air. And I was, even though we were shutting ICE down, I was still the chairman of Mayfair Games. And I still cared a great deal. In fact, I was very, very immersed in the Middle Earth or in the Catan project, excuse me. And so I had other things to do at that time. I had given my all for Middle Earth and for Rolemaster and for Ice, and I needed to move on. So that's what happened.
And did you ever do anything back with Iron Crown? Because I was speaking with Bob, who was behind the online rule set for the new version of Rolemaster, and he said, "Oh, you're speaking to
Uh,
Pete. Can you find out was his sister or sister-in-law responsible for Harp? Is that true?"
okay, so Harp was a project that grew out under was under John Seal's Ice, the Ice that survived the bankruptcy of 2000. It was reconstituted, and that was relicensed to Bruce Neidlinger and his wife Heike Kubosh. Bruce, as you know, had been working for me at the time. Ice shut down. Bruce is the number two guy at Ice. Bruce wanted to continue with Ice. He took that over and under his wing, and he and Heike and various other folks. I think you and Kurt Fisher and some of the old Ice people worked together to try and resurrect or to keep Ice afloat. And in fact, they did, kept it going for a long time. Now, it later turned out to come under the wing of Nicholas Caldwell
Hmm.
in the UK, and Nick Caldwell, sweet guy, was always fine in terms of reaching out to us, to me and to Coleman about Wolfmaster and about what had happened, what might go on, origins of things, and that. And he stayed in touch more with us than than before, and we kind of reconnected through Nick. Now, in the middle of all this, over the years, Terry Amthor had worked with Bruce on Shadow World,
Hmm.
and he'd taken over that project. Shadow World actually was derived from my old Loremaster project, originally the Iron Wind, actually, and Vogmore, but later Terry developed it, made it his own, and it became Terry's project. And he ran that for many years until he passed away, sadly, prematurely, only a few years ago. And then all along, there were some other guys, Nick Morowitz, who had been a production manager of ICE in the later years. He also worked with the Rolemaster project, first with, I think, for a time with Bruce Neidlinger, but later with Nick Caldwell. And Nick, who remains in town here in Charlottesville, Virginia, is a good friend, and we see him from time to time. And he kind of kept us appraised of what was going on a little bit. And then I guess about a year or two ago, I guess it was within the last 2 years, they released Rolemaster. This was Rolemaster Unlimited, and Nick Caldwell and Nick Morowitz brought it to us, sent it to us, and said, "Hey, do you got we'd like to do this. Do you guys, you and Coleman, what are your thoughts on it? And what are your thoughts on the credits?" And I looked at the credits at the time, and I said, well, these are all messed up. Over the years, so many people had worked on Rolemaster that people had lost track of who designed and created the damn thing. So we had to we sat down and looked back and recreated the credits as they should be, and with the idea that, hey, whose idea was this, and who did all this work? So in the end, it became you know it was my vision. It was Kurt Fisher and my design in the beginning. It became also Coleman Charlton's design over time, because Coleman went from being the lead developer, he was always the lead developer, to becoming much more of a designer later and overseeing the project. So he became that third and very important co-designer.
Yeah.
And then there were other designers that came along, but we were I was the guy that conceived it, and we were the guys that designed it. And that's the way, I think that's the way the record reflects it now, but who knows?
So just you reminded me about the credits, and so I've got here MERP, the credits page of that, and there's a few names there, and in between the middle names are quotes. I'm just wondering a couple of them. If you can make it's a while ago, Pete. So if you can't remember this, then don't worry. But like we've got Rick Britton, and he's saying, "What's a MERP?" What was the story behind that one?
Yeah, well, so Rick, okay, so the credits devolved. We always had fun nicknames for each other as gaming guys,
Hmm.
as just buddies in real life. But when we founded ICE, Rick had a bunch of friends that were working for him that actually were part of that crew that was working in the early days when we hadn't really launched fully, and we were running on a shoestring. So Rick was running the office, as I said, the first 2 years of ICE when I was still in law school. And we had a guy working with us called Leonard Swamp Cook, who was one of his best friends. And
Hmm.
he was just known as Swamp. And then we had another guy that was known just as Stitch, and another guy that was just known as Lawless. And these were names that were kind of common, just regular guys who had developed names that, and this was common in the time, particularly here in the, it's kind of the, or near the Appalachian Trail in Appalachia. And if you're on the Appalachian Trail, just as a note, you're backpacking, you don't use your own name. You use a name that people give you, or basically a nickname, and it's a trail name, okay? And so people have trail names, that other people give you, and so that's just a thing in the culture here. So we kind of blew that up, and and we decided, well, we got swamp in parentheses, but we have lawless and we have stitch, but we'll just start blowing it up a little bit. So Rick, became what's a MERP at one point because Rick didn't know what Middle Earth role playing was in the beginning, or MERP for a little while, even though he was running the company, because he was so focused on war games and the Civil War reenacting and all that stuff. So it was an insider joke about the fact that the guy, one of the number two guy in the company, our art director, initially did not know what we meant when we said MERP, and it was like, dude, it was Middle Earth role playing, and oh, okay, I understand, but it was that it became a joke around the office.
And Bruce's "this rule is stupid," was that several rules? Was that just like one of his sayings?
Yeah, Bruce was an accountant and was notorious for having a lack of tact, if you will. We're all on the spectrum, so to speak. And he was one of those guys that just, he didn't think about the fact that an unfiltered response of "this is stupid" or "this is awful," might be a little bit, what might lack diplomacy or might lack a little bit of tact here or there. And of course he also was one of those guys that saw a little bit black and white. He had a tendency to react good or bad rather than in a nuanced way. So when he ran into a rule that didn't work well for him, sometimes he was right, it was a bad rule, but sometimes it just, he rolled badly or something. He would say, "This is stupid," and particularly if you rolled an ought one followed by 99, kind of thing, and found himself dead. So anyway, it was one of those moments that we captured. We just thought, okay, this kind of captures Bruce right now in the moment.
And John's Mondo Bizarro. What is
Okay,
that? What is
who was the first name? Oh,
John
John
Green?
Mondo Bizarro Rumbler.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so John was our first production manager. He's the first real production manager, and John was a writer, actually a very fine writer. He'd written a number of books, novels, poet. He was a poet. He'd won a big poetry award. He wrote romance novels under a fictitious name, and we hired him because he was really, really good with words and a good editor. And he originally came on board as an editor, but because we didn't have a ton of money, we said, "John, you also have to be our production manager." He understood printing pretty well, so he became our production manager. And he didn't know any jack about games, actually, but he later went on to be one of our principal game book authors. The funny thing, though, was John was had a really twisted and fun personality. We all like black humor. We're all really, really kind of huge fans of Python and all kinds of humor like that. And John would play tricks. He was a real trickster, but he would also do bizarre stuff. So one time, one of our printers called us about a print question, and John recognized the voice on the other side. He'd answered for the company. We didn't have a secretary at the time. He decided to play a trick on the guy who was calling, and he faked a voice that was not his own. He said, "If you could please wait a moment, I'll get him," because the guy had asked for John Romler.
Mm-hmm.
He started singing as if it were hold music, right? He just started singing into the phone as if it were the hold music, and we were listening to this thing just going crazy. We were just laughing our asses off. because this, for the next minute or so, the guy on the other end of the line was listening to this thing thinking he was on hold. And eventually it came out that John was just, you know, spoofing the guy, but he would do stuff like that. So anyway, he was quite bizarre.
And your bit here, your one is 50 pages of what's it? Is 50 pages of races too much? No, I love reading the races. I thought it was a really good part of the book. So no, more. Great, Pete. So I think we'll leave it there because I've probably taken up a lot of your time, but I really do appreciate your time. It's fantastic and really fascinating what you said here. So thanks a lot, mate. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Take care, man.
And there you have it. What a great bloke. And patient too. We were at that interview process for 3.5 hours, probably over 3.5 hours. And he was just really patient. So excellent guy. And next time we'll have a talk with Jonathan Dale, one of the current custodians of Rolemaster, who basically helped RMU get over the line. We'll even have a giveaway. Anyway, take care. Cheers.